Hi, and welcome to this extra special episode of Light O'Clock. I'm your host, Caro, and today's episode is all about answering listeners' questions on the topic of light and circadian rhythms. Joining me today for this Q&A episode is Manuel Spitschan. So, welcome to the show, Manuel.
Thank you, Caro.
Some of you might remember Manuel from the first episode of Light O'Clock, where we talked about light exposure. But for those of you who are just joining us right now, Manuel is a professor for chronobiology and health at the Technical University of Munich in Germany, and also a group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics here in Tübingen, which is also where we are recording the episode. So his research focuses on the effects of light on human physiology and behavior. And today we're going to answer listeners' questions on the topic of light and light exposure and circadian rhythms. So today's episode is extra special for different reasons. So first of all, we're also recording with video for the first time, which is a new exciting format for us. And we are recording for a special occasion. So this episode is coming out on the 16th of May, which is International Day of Light. So some of you guys might be wondering, what is International Day of Light? Because maybe you've never heard about this. So this is a special international day, which is organized by the UNESCO. And it's a global initiative to basically celebrate the role that light plays in our lives. And it's important. So in different fields. So art, science as well, culture, education, and so on. And there are different events organized across the world. And so you can check all the events out, and you can also learn more about the event. If you check our show notes, we will have a brief link to the official website of the International Day of Light. And so as we're just wrapping up season 1 of Light O'Clock, we thought we might record this special Q&A episode for this special occasion. And before we dive into the episode, I just want to thank the audience, and in particular the listeners who sent us questions that we can answer in this episode. It is very important for us to make sure that we address your questions and also the topics that interest you most. So thank you so much for sending in those questions. Manuel, are you ready?
I am absolutely ready. Let's go.
Great. So I've organized listeners' questions in different topics, and we can go through them together.
Sounds great.
So the first topic is around the importance of light exposure, which we talk actually in the episode with you. So the very first episode of Light O'Clock. And just to provide a little summary to the listeners, we talk about the importance of receiving the right light at the right time. So during the day, we should be exposed to daylight possibly, or very bright light, let's say. And in the evening and in the night, we should be reducing the levels of light that we receive. So hopefully have dark nights. I think this is what we said. And so the first question comes from Elena from Switzerland. And this is about the exposure to daylight indoors or outdoors. She's asking, does daylight coming in from a window differ to daylight that I could receive if I were sitting outside instead?
So I think this is a really great question. I think the idea to have bright days and dark nights, I think, is one that I think we can write as a slogan on lots of things. And I think it's really an imperative to realize. And I think the question is, how do we realize it? I think we know that, of course, daylight is the brightest light source that we can typically get, that we typically encounter. And it's also abundant, at least during daylight hours. And of course, this depends a little bit on the season. One of the things that, of course, we know is that the glazing that we have in windows filters UV light out. So the light that you get in a room or in a building compared to outside has removed the UV light. And of course, that has beneficial properties because if you're exposing yourself to light through a window, you have a much lower risk of getting sunburned, for example. Overall, the spectrum isn't changing much. There's a little bit of differences due to the glazing, but ultimately you can get a lot of light just through sitting near the window. Ultimately, though, it really depends on the geometry, right? So if you're thinking about daylight sitting outside on an open space, you can turn yourself to, the sun or, looking in a way that, for example, if you're in a forest, you could be in a clearing. And so even outside, there's quite a lot of differences of how much light actually you receive at the eye. And of course, in a window, if you got a window, you can't just reposition the window, right? You got the window in one specific location facing in one direction. And so you're kind of limited to, well, is the window facing north, east, south, or west, and then, what is the time of day?
Of course. So in terms of like the amount of light that you receive, it's of course going to be less indoors than outdoors, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, cool. So
but it's, I think compared to electric light, you're still going to get, there's lots of factors that are kind of playing a role here, right? What's the cloud cover? What is the window size? Again, where's the window facing? What type of glazing do you have? But overall, I think getting daylight is a very cheap way, ultimately, very energy efficient way to get bright days into your life.
Fantastic. Great. So the next question comes from Eleonora from Italy, who is asking, are there levels of light that people should be receiving during the day? And she also has an example for this. For sleep, you hear that you should be sleeping around 8 hours per day. Are there similar values for light exposure? So I think where her question goes is a little bit in the direction of, okay, so for sleep, we have like 8 hours of sleep that we need to get. Like, is there a number of hours that we need to be exposed to, say, like a specific amount of light or so on?
So it's a great question. So in 2022, a group of international experts published this consensus recommendations for the type of light or the amount of light you should get to support healthy functioning, right? And so that basically proposed limits for daytime light exposure, but also pre-sleep and then sleep environment light exposure. And one of the numbers that is given there is what's called 250 lux melanopic equivalent daylight illuminance. I think we talked about this as well in the episode. Yeah. It basically is the biological effect of daylight at 250 lux. But of course, that doesn't tell us how do we reach that, right? Nor does it tell us, is 1 hour sufficient or 2 hours sufficient? Do you need 12 hours of your waking time? And ultimately, we need more data really to answer this question. So we need to be able to basically make recommendations, not only just on the amount of light, but also on the duration of light. So you can imagine a scenario where you might have 1 hour of a lot more light than 250 lux MEDI, but maybe that will have the same effect as, say, 4 hours of the same light, but at a fourth of the intensity. And so there's a lot of open research really that kind of we'll need to do, or the field needs to do, that looks at how do dose over intensity and time integrate.
Yeah, right. And so we have another question that ties in quite nicely with this one from an anonymous listener who is asking, how can we actually measure what light we're exposed to? So say now we know like during the day we should be exposed to this 250 melanopic EDI lux that you mentioned, but how do I know? How do I measure this? So they're asking, for example, maybe I'm exposed to insufficient light in my office, but I don't know yet. Is there an app that I can download to measure how much light I'm exposed to?
So this is a really great question, and I think it's one where the field is really lagging behind a little bit. So what we can get, or what people just can get, are relatively cheap lux meters. And so what they'll measure is basically the intensity of light as it appears to your brightness perception. Now, unfortunately, biologically, the photoreceptors, or the system that underlies our circadian system and our other physiological effects of light, doesn't follow that sensitivity curve. And so while we can get kind of a rough estimate of the light that we have in a specific condition, it doesn't really allow us to precisely estimate what the dose is, how much light we're getting that is relevant for these circadian effective photoreceptors. And I think, so metrology, right, so the field of defining measurement and measurement properties, accuracy and precision, of course, is a very precise field, ultimately, because everything that we have in science and engineering has to do with some type of measurement. And I think there's a lot of development going on to basically bring the right light measurement tools to people that are not, photobiologists or circadian biologists or neuroscientists. With apps, you can do a lot, but they will never give you an accurate estimate. So they give you a little bit of a ballpark idea, but for actual measurement, I think you'd have to look at a calibrated measurement device, which of course can be quite expensive. So there's a big gap, or big opportunity in a way to say we should really have at a scale some very easy tools to determine, is this light exposure good for my physiology, good for my sleep or not?
Yeah, maybe it's worth mentioning as well that some apps already exist. For example, I think on iPhones, you can have a look at like how much daylight you're receiving. So they have like an integrated light sensor, but there's no like device that is measuring light that the person is receiving, right? So yeah, it can be like a little bit tricky for like individuals to know in real time what light exposure they're receiving at the moment.
Absolutely, right? So I think you could do like spot measurements to say right now in this room, at this instance, at this time of day, what is the light exposure? But for everything else, you really need personal light loggers. So these are devices that you wear somewhere on your body that then will track how much light are you getting, over 24 hours, over the waking hours.
Yeah, so I guess for listeners to get an idea, it's a little bit like wearing a smartwatch, right? That tells you how many steps you're doing, heart rate, sports. So it's like measuring something. And in this case, it would be measuring light.
Exactly.
Great. The final question on this topic comes from Francesca, who is writing to us from the US. So she's asking, what can people do in parts of the world where there is too little or too much light? And actually, this question came up a lot. Do these people have different circadian rhythms than people who live near the equator? Yeah, so I think this goes a little bit in the direction of, okay, the world is big, right? There's people who in summer are exposed to almost continuous daylight. So for example, if we think of like Scandinavian countries, right? So Norway, Sweden, they have a lot of daylight during summer, and during winter is like the opposite. So how can they adjust their light exposure? It's easy for us to say, okay, like make sure you get, this amount of light during the day, but what can they do if they just cannot get that light?
So I think it's a great question. I think there is, a couple of components, a couple of things that I think are worth discussing, worth bringing out. I think the first one is, I don't think we have a full understanding even what the distribution of light exposure is on different parts of the world, right? So people living near the equator versus people living in Scandinavia will, just by virtue of the natural environment, receive just a lot of different light exposure. And so, of course, how do we know? What we can predict based on solar radiation models or maybe photoperiod, how much light exposure that is, but it still doesn't tell us how much they receive. Because ultimately, there's also a cultural component to this, right? How we interact with light and how we interact with daylight depends very much on the cultural context that we're in. And, saying, well, you should get as much daylight in a tropical climate where you will be probably it was too hot to go outside, or you try to find shade as much as possible. Of course, it's counterintuitive, right? Because ultimately what you want to be able to do is make recommendations that are, generally widely, applicable. I think in terms of supplementing light exposure in cases where you don't have enough light exposure from daylight, I think the idea would be, or the very simple solution for this would be to have a lighting system in your home that can adapt to your specific needs. And so most LED technology now has the ability to change not only the intensity, but also the color temperature. And so with this, you can do already a lot of kind of tailoring to your needs. And that opens up a different question, which is, unless you are aware of the kind of circadian needs that your brain and your body have, it's really tough to make this adjustment. But tunable LED lights that you can dim in the evening, make it a little bit more orange, might be just a very, very simple fix, I think, to having the wrong light at the wrong time. And then during the day, of course, you want to have very high quality lighting. And so, I think it really depends on where you are. But I think ultimately we want to have technology that assists us in getting the right light exposure.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is a really nice segue to our next question, which is a little bit more towards like technologies that can help people receiving healthy lighting. So a listener is asking, can you explain exactly what the night shift mode on my phone or laptop is doing, and why that is supposed to be better than having no night shift mode? I read a lot of conflicting information about how this works and whether it is effective.
So technologically, how it works, right? And I think this is important to distinguish technology from biology, right? Technologically, what the night shift mode is doing, it's basically the smartphone display has 3 independent lights, RGB, right? Red, green, and blue. And any color that is shown on this display will be a mixture of these 3.
Right.
And we know that the circadian system and our neuroendocrine system is sensitive to short wavelength light. So the idea is you basically reduce the amount of blue light you have by dialing down the intensity of that blue channel in your display.
Yeah.
And so, of course, this will reduce the amount of melanopic activation, the amount of activation of the IPRGCs. So what it's doing is relatively reducing the activation. But of course, the blue channel is also quite important for the white balance. So what it does, it renders then the display to look, of course, orangish, right? This is why it's kind of the orange shift. So biologically, it has some effect. it of course changes, what the display looks like.
Right.
But it's not as big as an effect that you might get if you were just reducing the display intensity, right? So at a given illuminance, if you turn the night shift mode on, you get a much stronger effect if you also dial down the intensity. But that's just technology, right? This is all stuff that's going to be true independent in a way of the effect on humans. And so I think this is so the effect on biology then I think is a lot more complex and a lot more nuanced, right? So I think there is a psychological component of changing the color temperature. I think some people might just prefer being in orange light rather than in the kind of coldish blue light. But of course, there's another underlying reason for why people use phones, right? And there's a psychological draw to picking up the phone to watch a TikTok video or to watch a video podcast.
Of course.
Or to check messages from your friends or whatever it is, right? And so light, we know, has an effect on our biology. But also, the reason why we, get poor sleep after watching our smartphone for a long time might not just be because of these effects of light, but because we're using the phone for something that activates us psychologically, right? And I think this is something where it's not just technology. There's of course biology, but ultimately it also is a question of psychological nature. Why do we use these phones? And I think a lot of apps have really harnessed kind of this the behavioral science to get us kind of hooked to screens.
Yeah, so I guess also like the content matters, right? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, it's the content, and I think it's also in a way, the habits that we build, right? So responding to emails late at night or just being connected all the time, right? All of this, I think, in addition to any light exposure at the wrong time, will probably also not be conducive to having excellent sleep, right? But I think this is really, in real life, really tough to tease apart.
Right. And also, I think maybe it's worth mentioning as well that if you have like the night shift mode turned on and also like the brightness of your screen like reduced, but in your room is still very bright because you have like lights everywhere, it's kind of doesn't help, right? Because you're still receiving light from another source.
Exactly. And if you think about a smartphone, right, that only fills up a fraction of the visual field, right? You have a lot more visual field that would be occupied by bright illumination in the room. And so I think it's sort of if you just were looking at a smartphone in a dark room, of course, then it's something to consider. But typically we're in illuminated rooms or lit rooms that have some type of light level anyway. So I think it's not a straightforward answer, unfortunately, to give. But I recognize that it's also something that has made people more aware of the light exposure that they get by using the night shift mode.
For sure, yeah.
I've also seen phones that now turn, and I think it kind of helps with the psychological behavioral component that basically make the display monochrome, right? So it might make using the phone psychologically less attractive because you're not watching the highly saturated videos, but it's kind of a grayscale version of that.
Yeah, for sure. Great. So the next question is about office lighting. So this question is coming from Elizabeth, who's writing to us from Germany. She's asking, bright LED lights in workspaces make me more tired than awake, especially in the evening when it's already getting dark outside. Could this have something to do with the fact that bright light is in strong contrast with the darkness outside, and the contrast tends to increase the perception of darkness? Are there any studies on the optimum lighting for the workplace depending on time of day and season?
That's a big question.
That's a big question.
That's a very big question, but I think a great question. I think so. There's probably some effects that I think we could investigate empirically. We know that the light has different effects depending on time of day.
Yeah.
In the office context, I don't think there have been any systematic studies that have looked at specifically, what light would be best at what time. And also, let's not forget that there's individual differences, right? So how we respond to light will be quite different from individual to individual. So I'm really glad that the listener asked this question, because it really shows that to provide practical solutions, practical answers, there's a lot more that we need to do to not only say, well, this is the light level you should get, but be a lot more specific, a lot more granular in making these recommendations.
The next question comes from Christina from Germany, who has a question about her alarm clock. She writes, I have a light-based alarm clock. are these actually useful or is it all placebo? So I think she's referring to these dawn lamps that you can set to turn the light on, like, say, 30 minutes before your usual wake time. And so when you wake up, for example, in winter, it's quite dark outside. And so it helps to have like a light that's already there in your room, right? So her question is kind of like, is this actually science-backed? Why do these lamps exist? Are these actually good for my circadian rhythms, I guess?
So I think the careful answer is there are some studies that have investigated sort of dawn simulation lamps and indeed recommend the use of them, I think, to kind of kickstart the circadian system. I personally use one. I think it's a great way to wake up. I think it kind of has a very slow ramp, and you kind of, in particular in the winter months, I think wake up a lot easier. Right. Because that ramp just makes sure that the thing that wakes you up is not some annoying alarm, right? I think the way the question is phrased is really interesting, because the first question was, is it useful? And the second question is whether it's a placebo.
Yeah.
So I think whether it's useful or not, I think is something that people should decide for themselves. Right.
Yeah.
I think there's a certain amount of self-experimentation that one can basically do is to figure out, does this specific solution work for you? Is this kind of lamp the right thing for me to feel good ultimately? In terms of placebo, I guess what's the control condition here, right? So the control condition in this situation would be as usual, right, which would be an alarm clock. And if you see any benefits in feeling energized after waking up with an alarm clock or with a dawn simulation lamp, of course, the dawn simulation lamp might be more useful for you.
Yeah.
I think you can make a naturalistic argument as well, right, which is that the type of square wave light pattern which you might get in the laboratory, or the alarm clock rings and you switch the light switch on. That's very, you typically don't encounter these conditions in any natural scenarios, right? So I think dawn simulation lamps can be useful, but I think that I probably wouldn't sign a blanket statement that will be useful for everyone, right? Because it really depends on, I think, building a personal routine that kind of works for everyone.
Yeah, totally agree. Great. So some listeners were interested in biological mechanisms of how light influences our circadian rhythms. So in the podcast, we talk about these cells, iPRGCs, which you also mentioned. So these are intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. So these are the cells that we mentioned contain melanopsin. And so these cells are responsible for using light from our environment to tell time of day, right? And so, some listeners had questions about iPRGCs. So one listener is asking, if our circadian system heavily relies on light input from the retina, right? So from the iPRGCs, how does this system work for individuals who have complete visual impairment, congenital or otherwise?
This is a really great question.
Yeah.
So in the mid-90s, a group of researchers at Harvard Medical School found that individuals who were functionally blind, who had gone to the eye doctor and said, you're blind, still suppressed melatonin during light exposure. So this was really a landmark paper that showed, well, there's got to be an eye-mediated system, some photoreceptors, some light-sensitive cells in the eye that underlie this physiological response. And, I think for us, it basically tells us, well, if you have a patient who under all clinical criteria is blind, they might still be responsive to light through these non-visual effects. I think around 20 years later, there was a group that also showed that if you have people who are blind and you expose them to light, their pupil will constrict. But at a much slower time scale than for healthy controls.
Right.
And the reason for this is the initial response in the pupil is due to cones and rods, and then the slow, sustained response is due to the iPRGCs. So if you're missing the cones and rods, you'll only have the iPRGC response. And so it takes about 5 seconds to see that response. And for any clinician, right, this is a really long time to do the pupillary light reflex, because, typically it basically constricts within 200 or 300 milliseconds. So you would kind of argue that, well, blind people, there's some evidence that they have these non-visual responses to light. But this is not universally true. So it depends really on the individual. There are some blind individuals where there is a residual light response and some where there's not. And so what's also been shown is that there are other ways to entrain the circadian system. And that includes, for example, meals, exercise, the sleep-wake cycle itself, and also social cues, right? So these individuals, if you took them out of their real-world conditions, they might have a free-running circadian clock. But under normal conditions, under their real life, the alarm clock and their sleep times would basically make them operate on a regular schedule.
Right. So I think in the first episode, we mentioned that light is this Zeitgeber, right? So it's like this time-giving cue, but also you're saying other things can be time-giving cues, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So like meals.
Meal timing, movement, exercise, social interactions, in certain animals, also temperature, right? So these things can all be used by the circadian system. And of course, we can isolate these parameters in the lab, right? We could say, well, everything else is constant, let's just modify the light. But in the real world, everything happens all at once.
Yeah, of course. Really tricky. Yeah, right. Cool. Thank you. Another listener is curious about the discovery of IPRGCs. They're asking, why were these cells, so the IPRGCs, only discovered in the 1990s, whereas the other cells in the retina, the rods and the cones, had already been discovered before?
So it's a really great question. So the rods and cones are actual structures that you can see when you're looking at the retina, an isolated retina on the microscope. And it turns out that they look like rods or they look like cones.
Right.
That's why they're called rods and cones. And so it's been known, at least since the 19th century, that these structures exist. And it's also been known that there are other neurons in the retina that are, taking that information through synaptic connections and then leaving the eye through the optic nerve. It's really only been 25 years because, of course, you need some way to tag specific proteins in specific cells. And so the whole biochemical and biological machinery that you would need to know to identify whether a cell expresses a protein really became only available, certainly not in the 19th century, but in the last 50 or 60 years or so. So the way that melanopsin was discovered was actually in the skin cells of these frogs, Xenopus. It's an African clawed frog, and it turns out that they change coloration, or they change their lightness under different lighting conditions. And that process is driven by melanopsin. It turns out the same protein is also found then in the mammalian retina.
Right. So these are the IPRGCs that contain melanopsin.
Exactly. Right? So IPRGCs now are these secondary neurons in the retina, and some of them, less than 5% of them, express melanopsin. And so it's when you look at the retina under a microscope, you don't see this special population of 5% of cells, unless you have some way to mark them through biochemical means.
Right. So there's just many more rods and cones than there are melanopsin expressing cells.
So that is for sure true.
Yeah.
But also the rods and cones are distinct structures, right? So
yeah. I get it. Cool. We also have some questions from listeners that actually will be answered in season 2 of Light O'Clock. But I thought maybe we can give them like a little quick answer so they don't have to, a little preview so they don't have to wait for too long. Yeah, so Lucas from Germany is asking a question about chronotype. Do night owls and morning larks really exist? If yes, what method is used to classify someone as such?
So that's a great question. I'm happy to share an anecdote surrounding chronotype that I think speaks to this question. So this is at the time that I was in Oxford, and we did a little public engagement event in the town hall, and we had a little kind of monitor that had a chronotype test. And so that answers part of the questions. We had a little questionnaire that asks, when do you like to do specific things? When do you go to bed, etc. And so a couple came to me, so husband and wife, and the wife complained to me that the husband is pretty lazy because he sleeps in and doesn't do, the household stuff, and would also go to bed late. And it turned out that he was just a late chronotype, while she was an early chronotype.
Right.
And so I never thought that in my career as a circadian and visual neuroscientist, I'd have to resolve marital conflicts. But fortunately, I was able to tell them, well, yeah, these are real effects. It's a biological phenomenon that there are early types and late types. And of course, there's different ways of determining this. So, questionnaires are one of them that basically ask specific questions. There's some that you also can take yourself. And then there's more biological means, right? So the way that you would then determine someone's specific circadian phase would be through melatonin, for example, in the lab or also at home.
Right. Yeah, the last question comes from Marlena, who's writing to us from Germany. So she's curious about jet lag. What happens exactly during jet lag to our circadian rhythms? Is it bad for humans?
So it's a great question. Jet lag is the phenomenon in which you are entrained to some specific time, which is, of course, mostly given by environmental cues, the light-dark cycle. And, of course, if you do travel across different time zones, then you have a synchronization or disconnect between your internal time, so your circadian time, and the environmental time. So that phenomenon where you're out of sync is called jet lag. And so is it bad? Well, there are some people who are chronically jet lagged because they are doing shift work in which, of course, your circadian system is kind of all over the place and the lighting conditions due to the demands of the job will differ, of course, depending on what type of shift you have.
Yeah.
We know that shift workers are at risk for developing specific health conditions. And of course, there's practical solutions around it, which is making shift schedules a little bit more biologically friendly and also helping shift workers, for example, with getting right light exposure at the right time, timing their meals. So there's some apps that help do this. But the jet lag phenomenon that you might get from flying, across the Atlantic or to Asia, that is something that, of course, will go away after a couple of days, maybe a week or so.
Right. And is that because, so you're in this new place, right? And then you kind of try to synchronize to the new kind of light-dark cycle, right?
Exactly.
So then you receive light and your body's like, oh, actually it's not 8 a.m. as I thought. It's actually like 11 a.m. And so you kind of synchronize through that new light input.
Exactly, yeah. So it's not only light input, it's also what you eat and when you eat it.
Right.
It's also your sleep-wake cycle. So there's lots of different things that can help the circadian clock re-entrain. And the same phenomenon also happens then when, daylight saving times happens.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. So thank you so much. This was really fun for me. I hope you also enjoyed it. Thank
Absolutely.
you for sharing your expertise and insights.
It was really great. Pleasure and privilege to be here. Thank you.
Super. And so I also hope that our audience enjoyed this episode and that our listeners felt like their questions were addressed and answered. Remember, you can always send us questions, not just at the end of the season, but also during the season as well. You can drop us an email to our email address, which you find in the show notes. And as you know, we will go on a little show break. So Light O'Clock is coming back midsummer. So we'll be back with a brand new season. And if you're listening to this on International Day of Light, so the 16th of May, make sure you find some time today to just celebrate the importance of light in your life. May that be by just going outside for a little walk in daylight or just appreciating how easy it is to just switch lights on and off in your room, perhaps. Until season 2, it was a pleasure and goodbye.